One definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and over again and expecting a different result. And at least since World War II. And I think I could take it all the way back to the administration of Woodrow Wilson. The American citizenry have been electing one party or another party, one candidate or another candidate, expecting a different result. And since at least 1898, the policies of the United States have not changed. They've been imperial since actually they've been imperial for longer than that, but I can date it from 1898 because up until 1898, the imperialism was interior rather than exterior. With the Spanish-American War, the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, Viet Nam, all of the little countries, including, what was that little island country, Granada, have been imperial. All of the wars in the 21st century have in fact been imperial. They've had other disguises, but they've been imperial. So I'll stay according to my outline. So, can we win against the ruling elites, whoever the ruling elites are? The American people have been indoctrinated that the white hats win against the black hats in a television program the length of 30 minutes. Or at the very, very most, a 5-segment TV series lasting 5 evenings. These episodes invariably end with either Tom Cruise or John Wayne, my generation, or someone else of a younger generation beating the bad guys at the last minute of the game. I think that even happened at the latest Super Bowl, didn't it? This is what a friend of mine told me. Anyway, if that's what winning means, then the answer is no, we're not going to win. I would like you, however, to for a moment put yourself in the situation of an East German carpenter around 1980. The Stasi is spying extensively on you and everyone in East Germany. You have a guaranteed job and a subsistence living that is actually the envy of some people in the Western world today. But you are living in what is recognizably a tyranny. Alternatively, if your knowledge of the Old Testament is pretty good, you can imagine yourself in Babylon of 550 BC. Now Cyrus of Persia and his armies conquered Babylonia in 539. But if you were a slave in Babylon in 550, the future looked very, very bleak. So, if winning is the possibility of surviving until things get better, in that sense, it is possible that we will win. I want to point out that from time immemorial, because I'm in part going back on the, I don't want this thing to forget who we are. I'm going back on the size of the problem, the size of the beast which we are overcoming. From time immemorial, human beings have been forced to reproduce in order to just barely replace their losses. There was not enough food if you gathered into a tribe, which was the only smart thing to do, back before iron tools, if you didn't have a tribe, you were gonna die. And if someone in the tribe was sick and couldn't either hunt or farm, someone else had to do more work because it was subsistence living. Go back to the times when settlements were established and we were no longer wandering, we were no longer, I have this problem with anomic we were no longer moving from one spot to another spot, either following the animals from whom we fed off of, or following the rain so that we could plant crops or gather the crops. Once settlements took place, it was possible to have enough excess so that someone could rise to the top of the food chain and take control over the people. So you had kings or an aristocracy, not a very big one, but an aristocracy, usually a priesthood, a priestly aristocracy, and a kingship, because the king, as Michael Hudson rightly points out, was in charge of the calendar. He was able to tell you because he knew the seasons and he knew when the sun was going to be here. He knew when the season of this moon or that moon was coming, and your planting season was totally controlled by that. So the king had a certain amount of power, as did the priests. And there was enough surplus so that the serfs could feed the king and the priestly class and still survive. But Hudson rightly points out that if someone other than the privileged class tried to get rich, it was really an insult. It was really, I don't want to use the word sin, but it was an offense to the rest of the group. Because if someone got wealthy, it was at the expense of somebody else getting poor. In those types of societies, it was the rule rather than the exception for, under certain circumstances, for debts to be forgiven. If, for example, someone who had an excess of cash loaned money to someone who had a temporary deficit, and if that person with a deficit got into bad straits, for example, there was a drought, the person who held the debts was morally bound, because it was recognized that debts accumulate faster than the wealth to repay the debts. The person who held the debt, that is, who held the IOU, was bound to forgive the IOU. And kings who were in charge of the granary, when granaries were held by the elites and by the king, they were honor-bound to forgive debts, especially if the city-state was going to be attacked. Because the best way to lose your kingdom was to hold on to the debts so that the people in your kingdom said, the guy who is trying to beat our king is going to forgive our debts if we go over to his side. Great way to get people to go over to the opposition side. This was formalized in Athens when Solon bribed the people who were going to be electing. He bribed them with better jobs. Not money per se, but he was using the position of being able to give jobs in the future as a tool for getting votes. The point that I am making that is, in earlier civilizations, debts accumulated faster than you could pay them off, and there was a civil way of coping with that problem. Now, with civilizations that developed in the Middle Ages, you had multiple artisan classes in addition to a ruling elite. And with those, there was more social and economic mobility. A serf was owned by the land, and his progeny were owned by the land, because the serf, when he kissed the landowner's ring, he was pledging lifetime service to the land. If, however, he was in a position to gain a job for his son in town as an apprentice to a goldsmith or a silversmith or a blacksmith or any of the trades, he could get his son out from under serfdom. So there was a bit more economic and social mobility. But even there, you're talking about a very small surplus of essentials for the population that you had. And a third of the European population disappeared with the Black Plague at the end of the 15th century. I've got to get my water because I'm already starting to chai.
It's very late.
Thank you. Now, it has been with the technological revolution in the last 20 to 30 years that we literally, on the face of the earth, have more people than we need. I want to repeat that. We literally have more people than is needed to accomplish the work that is at hand. And you can be absolutely certain that the elites of the world, who own something like, I'm going to take a rough guess here now because I don't have the exact figure, roughly 70 to 80% of the tangible wealth in the world is held by 10% of the human population, probably less than that depending on how the numbers are manipulated. I've got a study here that shows that the very top 0.1% own as much wealth as the lower 50% of the American population. If you include that to 1% rather than 0.1%, they own as much as about 80 to 90% of the American population. If my wealth were, if I were to stand up and talk about the wealth of the American people and compare mine to the lower 50%, mine would come to my shoulder and the lower 50% would probably come to my waist. If I were to draw a comparable analogy to the top 1%, their wealth would stand at the top of one of the highest buildings in the world. And if I were to compare it to the wealth of the 0.1%, that tower would extend probably 3/4 of the way to the moon. That's the kind of wealth inequality we're talking about. So, with that in mind, that is the nature of the problem in terms of getting something more like a rational distribution. Now, if I can get this thing to wake up again, so the issue that we have is getting some kind of rational redistribution of wealth from the top 0.1% to the human population. That's what we are calling winning. This is from a very pleasant movie that some of you may recognize and some of you will not. Horton Hears the Who.
They don't believe we're here. We've got to make some noise! We are here! We are here! We are here!
We are here! We are here! We are here!
Come on! Everybody! We are here! We are here! We are here! This will teach
told you not to make up stories about people on specs! Listen, there they are! Robin, teach 'em! It's not working. I can hear you, but their ears aren't strong enough.
We need to be louder! Get every who to make noise! Everyone! Jojo, where are you going? We need every voice! Jojo!
You need to make some noise down there, or we'll all be destroyed!
And that yacht, that one small extra yacht, put it over. And all the who noises burst out of the clover.
I hear it. So do I.
Rudy, give me that. Come, Rudy, get back in the pouch. Now.
No, Mom.
Wickershams, get that clover. Well, anybody, take it from him. You did it, Mayor. You did it.
We did it!
Now, from our point of view, the bad news is this. Unlike the jungle animals, our ruling elites do not need to be convinced that we are here. They full well know it, and they have plans for dealing with the problem of the overconsumption of the lower 90% of the human population. Vaccines is one approach. Brain molding is another approach. Getting everyone to walk in lockstep so that we are a totally predictable population is another step. But there is a program for manipulating and managing the lower 90% so that we, A, will consume less, B, a certain percentage of us will be eliminated, and C, those who remain will be docile and manageable. Occasionally when I'm talking to a friend who is open to the question, I ask them, would you rather be a caged chicken, a free-range chicken, or a grouse? On the presumption that the grouse is free to roam, free to either be caught by the coyote or escape from the coyote. And a few people answer that they would rather be grouse. But in all candor, most of them, they don't want to be a caged chicken, but being a free-range chicken is not too bad an idea. Well, when I'm using that little vignette to demonstrate that our problem is not only with the ruling elite, the problem with is partly with the utter brainwashing of a substantial percentage of the human population. So, beginning with the 14th Amendment, let me get this out of the way. I want to, where is it there? Maybe going back even further. I don't know if, now it should ask me what to open it with, because I can, in the first section of the 14th Amendment, it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, subsequent to the passing of the 14th Amendment, which was approximately 1867, the Supreme Court itself has admitted that there are three definitions of the phrase, the United States. So the interesting question comes up, which of those three definitions applies in this amendment? The first definition of the United States is that nation state that exists as a nation state in the community of nations. Well, that doesn't apply because to be a citizen, you've got to be a citizen of a specific government. Second definition is the states united in the Constitution. That's not a government. The third definition is the government of the District of Columbia, DBA, doing business as the United States. This is a new definition of the United States. It comes along with the 14th Amendment. And I personally am no longer a citizen of the District of Columbia doing business as the United States. I sent a letter to the Secretary of State disavowing the citizenship that I did not wish to have and did not knowingly volunteer for. But every person who has a Social Security card in this room, other than myself, is a citizen of the District of Columbia doing business as the United States. Every black person whose parentage is from a slave, that is a black slave from the Confederacy, from the southern states before the Civil War, is by definition a citizen of the District of Columbia doing business as the United States. Let's see, other ways. If you go to the city office down, I don't remember the name of the street, and register to vote, you're going to be asked, are you a citizen of the United States? If you check that off, you have volunteered to become a citizen of the District of Columbia doing business as the United States. Now, what are the advantages of being a citizen of the District of Columbia doing business as the United States? Well, you get to use zip codes. You get to pay into the Social Security Fund, and if it still survives that long, you get the benefits of Social Security when you retire. You get to participate in Medicare and Medicaid, and you have the privilege of supporting the Federal Reserve System by paying your income tax. The size of the problem was partly defined with the 14th Amendment because they needed to recruit citizens who were willing to pay taxes. And up until the 14th Amendment, the United States government could not tax the individual citizen. Up until the 14th Amendment, the United States government could place a tax on the several states, and the several states could then tax their citizens, and the states would pay the national government on the basis of the taxes that the states collected from the citizenry. Up until the Civil War, that was an inefficient way of funding the federal government, and the vast major percentage of the federal funding of the federal government up until the Civil War was in tariffs. Tariffs derived from people buying material from Europe, but the price of the European item was jacked up by the United States government placing a tariff on it, so that when a Southerner bought some machinery from Europe, he paid the Europeans a certain amount of money for the machinery, and he paid the federal government the tariff that was placed on it. So when economists tell you that tariffs are taxes, they are absolutely right. And the tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed on Chinese goods are taxes on the American people that are going to be paid to the federal government if you want to buy a Chinese or Japanese car, as the case may be. After the Civil War, it became legal for the federal government to tax federal citizens individually. Now, between the Civil War and the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank, the only citizens that were taxable were liberated slaves and their progeny. However, we were offered the privilege of using Federal Reserve notes instead of gold around 1913, and as a result of those privileges, we have volunteered to stand behind the federal debts that are owed to the Federal Reserve Bank. No one here in this room owns a allodial title probably to anything. I was going to say to the clothes on your back. I know you do not have a allodial title to any cars that are represented here, any land that is represented here. Allodial title means title that is absolute. If I don't pay my taxes on the property that I own in Iowa City, sooner or later, Iowa City has the authority to confiscate that property. Likewise with a car. Likewise with anything. Likewise with your children. The principle and legal reason that the state can seize your children is that when a man and woman in the United States get married, they get a license from the state. They have included the state in the legal business of their marriage, and the state assumes proprietorship over the progeny of that. Now, 99.999% of couples getting married don't know that. 99.9999% of couples take good care of their kids. Maybe that number is a little smaller than what I decided. And so the state doesn't legally and or morally feel it needs to intervene. However, if you don't have your children immunized according to the state regulations, then they might. There are states that are attempting to take legal action against families that are resisting the immunization right. And that will come up in subsequent classes. The point that I am making is that we are caught in a web that is owned by the state, and that state is owned by the Federal Reserve. It's actually literally owned by the people who own the Federal Reserve banks. And the people who own the Federal Reserve banks are certain families, certain American families, and certain European families. You never encounter this unless once in a couple decades a member of the House of Representatives or a senator says, holy cow, the American people are really getting shafted. I'm going to call the people's attention to what they are really, to the slavery to which they are already held. One representative had 3 attempts on his life somewhere around 1948 when he attempted to do this. And another one was convicted of a major felony somewhere in the 1990s. It's not good for your health to call attention to this kind of problem. I want to make one other observation about the Federal Reserve System, in that oh, the thought left me, I apologize. Let me get back on my not here. The thought on the Federal Reserve will come back to me, but it has lost me. I'm still talking, however, about the size of the problem. So the Federal Reserve System owns all of the, let me put it this way, and it's much more legally more appropriate. When the United States government reached a contractual arrangement with the Federal Reserve banks, they pledged as collateral for any funds that were loaned to the United States government, they pledged as collateral the people and the property of the United States, which is why you will get common title, but you will not get allodial title, because that, the ultimate ownership of all of the material wealth of the United States has been pledged as collateral to the debt that the federal government owes to the Federal Reserve Bank. That's one part of the problem, but only part of the problem, because I'm still talking about the size of the issue. On another occasion, I will show you a video demonstrating that Merck or some other pharmaceutical company is actually a company that produces vaccines. That is, although the CDC is supposed to be a federal agency, it actually functions like a commercial agency. The 7 power centers that control everything that has economic significance in the United States are the media, and I list the media and telecommunications industry first, not because financially they are as important as the military-industrial complex, but because any of the other 6 need the cooperation of the media and telecommunications in order to sell the program to the American people. The last thing the ruling elites of the Western world want is a population that becomes aware of their slavery. So the television and telecommunications services are vital for keeping the people anesthetized, and I apologize for using the word stupid. On the other hand, in terms of expenditures, no doubt the military-industrial complex is the biggest buyer of goods and distributor of monies to Lockheed, Boeing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can't at this moment come up with the company that Richard Cheney was president or vice president of, but you get the idea. The military-industrial complex spends 50% of the disposable income of the federal government. In and of itself, there were stacks of, I think, $100 bills that were shipped to Iraq while we were buying the peace of the insurgents there. Big Pharma controls the healthcare industry, and as a physician I will tell you that we are trained pretty much to think, especially in the primary care services, to think of dealing with the distribution of medicine for the maintenance of medical problems rather than the curing of medical problems. But Big Pharma is big business, as is apparent from the fact that Since 1985, the number of required immunizations has more than tripled, and there is no liability to any of the companies making vaccines because the Congress, in its care and nurturing of the business, has created a federal agency for dealing with dangerous or ill-considered side effects and tragedies secondary to the administration of vaccines. So the American population is required to be vaccinated. They have very little chance of making the company that has produced a dangerous vaccine pay for their malfeasance. And even the American people, via the federal government, pays what little compensation that injured family gets. We're talking about the care and feeding of capitalism by our federal government. The extraction industry, well, there's a very nice relationship between the forestry industry, the coal industry, the mineral industry, and the farmers who want to raise cattle on public land, or the foresters who want to harvest wood on public forests. AIPAC is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and anything that concerns the Middle East, the Israel lobby gets what it wants. And I hope some people who want to argue with me on that watch the video, because that's the easiest assertion to prove. We the American people are currently giving a minimum of $4 billion a year to the nation state of Israel. And if we do not, then the congressperson or the senator, or God forbid, the president, who does not sign the legislation, will be attacked viciously, so that the best job insurance for any national representative is to be pro-Israel. That is a disaster and an embarrassment and a shame, but it is also a fact. The fire industry is very important, and the fire industry comes to the lead in the last decade, because the fire industry, the word fire represents finance, insurance, and real estate. And the stock market has more than doubled in what we call value, because the Federal Reserve System has pumped so much money into the financial system, and the only place where that money could go was in the stock market. Land values and property values have increased somewhat, but not nearly as much as they would have if the stock market hadn't soaked up all of that excess money. Last on the list is agribusiness. Most of the farmers today are actually vassals of one or another of the companies producing seed, antibiotics, weed killers, and farm equipment. If you want to raise chickens on an industrial scale, you basically become a vassal of one of the 3 or 4 major chicken producers in the world, in the country. Every one of these industries has a financial interest in maintaining the system as it stands. This is the nature of the ruling elites we are up against. So, I'm going to go back to my list. We are looking at a community of ruling elites who have had 150 years to perfect the system and to seduce and or coerce people who are in a governmental position to help them maintain and stabilize the system as it exists. And you and I are Whoville on that little clover. I wish to show you now a relatively short clip. I will introduce it. This is from the film entitled Behind the Lines. Behind the Lines is the more or less true story of Siegfried, can't recall his name, I'm sorry, but he is an officer in the British Army during World War I, and he has become totally disillusioned with not the conduct of the war, but the pursuing of the war long after it has become a war of aggression rather than a war of defense. So we're talking about 1916, thereabouts. And I'm using this as an allegory for you so that you understand where I'm going with it. This is a soldier who is opposing a war, but in opposing the war, he's opposing the whole damn system. And I'm asking, how, if you were in his situation, would you oppose the whole damn system?
I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. Also, I believe that I may help to destroy the callous complacence with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share.
And which they have not sufficient imagination to realize. Yes, Sassoon.
They want him to be your patient.
Why?
So that when his declaration is read out in the House of Commons, they can say Sassoon is suffering from mental breakdown and is now undergoing treatment by the eminent Dr. William Rivers. Will you take him?
Well, eminence never got me a choice of patients before. So, do they want me to declare he's mad or say that he's sane?
They want you to persuade him he's wrong.
That's not what I do.
Which is why you're being allowed to choose if you take him.
Do you have a file?
Here.
Good Lord. You want an MC?
1.5 hours under gunfire, bringing out the wounded. Conspicuous gallantry. Took a German trench, single-handed.
I'll take him. Sassoon. Yes. Mr. Sassoon. Ready?
One of us is in the wrong place, Dr. Rivers.
Oh, well, I remember. There was a telegram from your friend, Captain Graves. He missed your train.
Typical of him. Prisoner arrives without escort.
You're not a prisoner.
Oh, you mean I can go?
You're under orders. We all are. Through here. Why do they call you Mad Jack?
Graves has been telling secrets, has he?
He's very concerned for you.
Because I liked going out on patrol, looking for Germans to kill.
Taking unnecessary risks is one of the first signs of a war neurosis.
I didn't know that.
Nightmares and hallucinations come later. Do you suffer from nightmares? Hallucinations?
When I woke up, the nightmares didn't always stop, so I used to see corpses. Men with half their faces shot off, crawling across the pavement. People were treading on their faces.
And you were awake when this happened?
Yes. I wrote 1 or 2 quite good poems at the time.
Oh. I'd like to see them.
Shouldn't you be asking me about my declaration? That's what got me sent here.
You threw away your military cross. You must have been in agony when you did that.
Agony's lying in a shell hole with your leg shot off. I was upset.
Would you describe yourself as a pacifist?
No. I can't say no war is ever justified.
You said a friend was killed.
His name is David.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Barnum, sir.
Miss Crowe, this is Mr. Sassoon, our latest arrival.
Welcome to our hospital, Mr. Sassoon.
Miss Crowe is the way, the truth, and the light at Craig Lockett.
That is blasphemy, Doctor.
And she's the only one who can read my handwriting.
Captain Rivers.
Another patient. Sorry.
Oh, my bedroom door has no lock on it.
None of them have. Privacy isn't part of the cure, I'm afraid.
You don't think I'm mad, do you?
I don't think you're even suffering from war neurosis.
Good.
You seem to have a very powerful anti-war neurosis. You realize, don't you, that my job is to try and change that?
Closing comments there are really quite important, although they are tossed off. It's the job of the system in which we live to make you and me totally unaware of the system in which we are living. Charlotte Isserbyte is the author of The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. And she took a number of courses. She's a very intelligent woman. She started out with a silver spoon in her mouth, but she didn't know it. So she got acquainted with the lower and middle classes by the jobs she took. And subsequently, she became a member of a local school board. And as a member of a local school board, she was progressively educated as to what the Department of Education was doing. And she learned that in spite of the best intentions of the best of our teachers, the school system is intended to make stupid pupils. Not stupid in a formal sense, but in the sense that they are not capable of connecting dots. They're capable of regurgitating information, but not capable of integrating that information into a meaningful program. I'm going to remind those of you who were here, and I'll share with those who were not earlier, the Prussian educational system was set up in the late 19th century to have 0.5% of the population be capable of critical thought and integrating information. The next 5% were consciously and intentionally trained to be good at a particular specialty: engineer, physician, electrician, etc., etc., etc. Not particularly trained for the electrician to integrate chemistry, but for the chemist to understand chemistry very well, and if he needed to talk with the electrician. The lower 95% in the Prussian educational system were trained and developed to fit into whatever size hole the job and or the society required to have filled. We're not trained to think critically or to understand the relationship between economics, history, and politics. They were trained to fulfill a particular job. And that educational system was transported to the United States in the last quarter of the 19th century. My father's generation, even though my father slept through most of high school because he was working at the same time as he was going to high school, my father's generation was smarter than mine. And my generation was smarter than my son's. And his generation is smarter than my grandson's generation. And that's not an accident. That's by design. Indeed, George Soros successfully sold the American system of education to the Russians around 1995. And they are now reaping the consequences of that. And they discovered that the kids who were trained under the George Soros dictated program of education are not performing nearly as well as the kids who were trained under the communist system. The communist system was bad in terms of teaching political philosophy, but in terms of teaching mathematics and electronics, they did pretty darn well. Now,
can you describe the differences between those systems? Was it, what was the basic difference?
the basic, let me contrast it with what currently is being pushed. We are currently pushing children to learn facts to pass certain tests. Those tests are, and this has been demonstrated with, in terms of medical education, there is a science to passing multiple choice tests, which is a different form of understanding and intelligence than taking good care of a patient. Totally different. But I could become perhaps the lowest ranking graduate of a college of medicine by being a really good analyst and student as to how to pass multiple choice tests, which would have, it is also demonstrated by the fact that Catch Me, the human being who was the substance of the movie Catch Me If You Can was able to fake competence in any of several job types by knowing how to interact with people and knowing how to answer the most superficial of questions. So the students coming out of the educational system now are loaded with facts, but they do not have an integrated understanding of the subject matter. When Carroll Quigley wrote Tragedy and Hope, he was firmly aware of the difference. I don't have it on this particular computer. But Carroll Quigley says, I need to have students who have a lot of facts, but that's not enough. If I get the students who have a lot of facts, I will teach them how to integrate fact A with fact C and fact J so that they understand the implications of fact X, Y, or Z. The integrated understanding of one small area of biology is sufficient to become a really good biologist, because once you know how to integrate the information, you can find the information in that book or this website. But if you don't know how to integrate the information is totally useless. It's like having a set of blocks in front of you, but not knowing the alphabet to know to put the blocks A, B, C, and D. If you know the alphabet, you can assemble the blocks in any set of blocks, whether the color of the blocks is red, blue, gray, or silver. The child who knows the alphabet has an integrated understanding of the alphabet. But a child who doesn't know the alphabet is going to put A, X, Z, Y. And therein is the difference in the American educational system. It keeps us nice and stupid so that we accept what our politicians tell us, it accepts what our teachers tell us, it accepts what people in authority tell us. It accepts when a journalist on the side of the street or a speaker on the side of the street says, the buildings fell because the heat got so hot that they lost structural stability. That was told by a person in the street on September 11th of 2001. That was canned information that was fed to the American public, and the American public opened up their mouths and the top of their heads and absorbed it. You had a comment, Quinn?
Oh, I was just going to say, I have grandsons going through school now, and it's amazing. I mean, it's one standardized test after another. Test. The teachers, a lot of the teachers don't like it either.
Oh, the teachers.
Well, they're no fun to teach to the test, and
No.
I think, but I see a little hope because, like, I've got one 15-year-old grandson that he hates those tests, and he thinks they're the most boring thing he's ever experienced, and he feels like he's in prison when he sits in class. So,
And he's right.
I mean, I think that there are kids who get it. Not enough, maybe, but.
Thomas.
And, oh, also, just one other thing. The California schools, for what it's worth, are trying to get rid of standardized tests. And so I saw an interview with a woman recently elected to the school board in our city. And somebody asked her what she thinks about California getting rid of standardized tests. And she said, well, we keep our eye on it, but we think they're important. And then I remembered that this woman works for ACT, who's what's American College Testing, one of the companies that rakes in billions of dollars on these standardized. So I'm just agreeing with you.
But it was interesting just because what you were saying about Russia is the same with Yugoslavia. Even though it was communist education, it was much more intense. So now they're changing all of that, and a lot of like my parents' generation or the older generations are really upset because they're seeing the new books that are coming, and it's the whole Bologna system, and all of Europe is starting to have, which is lots of tests that are coming out of these books that are reprinted, and it's so shocking how many books they're changing. Up until 90, I don't know, it was up until almost 2000, there's a certain set of books that over 50 years were being used, and then all of a sudden they were changing. So this is like the new generation that's being dumbed down, and it's really apparent. So I think it's happening all over.
And the smartest kids, fortunately, are rebelling against it, and the parents who recognize the validity of their kids' complaints are recognizing it. So there is pushback, which leads me, I'm going to, after we discuss the Skeptic's Pledge, I'm going to play a video, but you're free to leave if time constraints, but I want you to see it because it's actually pretty well done. What can you do? You can be a skeptic. You can take the Skeptic's Pledge. I will not be beeped. I will not listen when my car tells me to fasten my seatbelt. I will fasten my seatbelt. But every once in a while, I personally let it beep like hell because it shuts itself off after a minute. Every time you are beeped by a machine, you are being programmed to follow the machine. A friend of mine was very pleased to tell me that Amazon now is so consumer friendly that if you've got something to return to Amazon, you can get a shipping label from your email, drop it off at the post office, and you don't have to do anything for it. You're being very well trained to be a consumer. Who's training you to be a citizen? I will not be programmed. I will not be chipped. We've got a video, some of you have seen it in the past, where Aaron Russo talks that one of the programs, one of the goals of the ruling elite is to have everyone with a embedded computer chip so that all of your history, all of your finances are contained on the information on that computer chip. And if you have the audacity to oppose what the system is doing to you, they'll turn off your chip. You can no longer buy anything. You turn on the electric switch in the house you thought you owned, no electricity, no water flowing.
Oh, that's
you-
in Revelation. So, just have to say.
I know you had to, but you still owe me a cup of coffee.
Okay.
The point being, by the way, the computer chip is not in the Book of Revelation. The point being that if they can get us to move in that stockyard channel, we will be perfectly manageable like the chickens in a chicken coop. I will ask questions, I will offend the thought police, which means I don't have a whole lot of friends, but that's enough. And I will be skeptical of what everybody knows. This is a very crude skeptic's pledge, but I invite you to take a look at it. There are two proposed constitutional amendments. I have very little hope in amending the Constitution for different reasons. But one of them wants to deprive corporations of personhood. And for a bunch of legal reasons, I think that is nonsense. The other one, however, is very well thought out and wants every state in the Union to pass a state amendment taking money out of state politics and to get enough momentum in the state citizenry to pass such an amendment to get money out of federal politics. That is both doable and would have some substantial impact. Would it be a complete cure? No. It would be a start. What are some of the other things we can do? You can go to a website called theconsciousresistance.com. I can send that out. It's run by a kid. Forgive me, Vera, but about your age. I do that to people a lot. I embarrass Catherine quite occasionally. The point being that James Corbett and the young man running this website are consciously resisting walking in that sheepfold. And everything we can do to resist walking in that sheepfold is good for us and is a reminder to other people who are walking like chickens or sheep that there is another way of doing things. I am delighted that some of the students are reacting to the educational system. I am delighted that a substantial number of people are saying, I don't want to be spied on. 5G technology, there is no demand whatsoever from the population for 5G technology. The demand for 5G technology is coming from the institutions and the government who want to keep track of where you are and what you're doing. By the way, 5G technology is also a threat to local sovereignty, because according to the use of 5G technology, the company has the privilege of telling the local city or county or location where they need to put their towers, which means you have taken another bit of sovereignty away from local government. And I guarantee you, in this country particularly, the county sheriff is the most reliable government official who may reasonably be relied to help you protect your own privileges and safeguards. If nobody else has any suggestions for the Skeptic's Pledge, I'll play this last video because it's worth seeing.
Nightmare and insanity are akin. Mysterious and involuntary states that skew and distort objective reality. One wakens from nightmare. From insanity, there is no awakening. Whether Americans live in the one state or the other is the paramount question of this era. For 200 years, Americans have been indoctrinated with a mythology created, imposed, and sustained by a manipulating cabal, a financial elite that built its absolute control on the muscle and blood, ignorance and credulity of its citizenry. It has now metastasized into the corporate tyranny that owns and controls America. America began with the invasion of a populated continent and the genocide of its people. Once entrenched, it embraced enslavement of another race. With those pillars of state in place, it declared itself an independent nation in a testament that proclaimed the equality of all mankind. In that monumental act of hypocrisy, America's myth had its genesis. A constitution was written that came to be regarded as Holy Writ. Designed by men of wealth and prominence, its central purposes were to defend private property and suppress mass democracy. It has fulfilled those mandates beyond the dreams of its creators. With the existing oligarchy secure in law and native people largely exterminated, the ruling class increased its wealth and power fantastically in the 19th century, using the government as its enabler, exploiting to the limit the device of chartered corporations. So empowered, the financial elite used the military to expand its sway beyond the continent. Regions, territories, islands, and whole countries were annexed, invaded, and possessed outright, their peoples crushed, suppressed, and exploited. Because ordinary Americans, like any people, need to believe that whatever the ruling class undertakes in their name must be essentially benevolent, noble in purpose, and justified in fact, the American myth had to be radically modified for imperial expansion. The foundational myth was that the Americans had come to a howling wilderness teeming with godless savages, and through invincible strength of character and purity of purpose had tamed the land and honorably earned the right to possess their bountiful home. In the era of extraterritorial expansion, that version was polished to justify and ennoble imperialism. The new corollary was that America was obliged by our manifest destiny to carry our mission into barbaric darkness wherever tyranny created abuse and suffering. A national myth that absolutely binds the loyalty of a people to its government must be a subtle and powerful elixir that elevates and aggrandizes that people's self-regard. National policy will then appear to be an extension of its superior citizenry's inchoate will and an instrument of justified arrogance toward the lesser world. The simple, powerful myth of America's heroic and altruistic benevolence, shaped by the financial elite, infused Americans with a hubristic belief in their racial superiority that mobilized gave imperialist enterprises the character of a quasi-religious crusade. In this way, insatiable imperialism acquired the apparent moral perfection of a syllogism. With World War II, the world was reconfigured. American capitalism emerged supreme from the horror that had virtually wrecked its capitalist partners. The Soviet Union, though, in spite of having absorbed much the greatest devastation of all from Nazi Germany, rose astonishingly from its ruin to become the sole rival to America as a world power. This challenge was not competitive, it was systemic. Soviet communism was a direct threat to American hegemony in that it categorically refuted the philosophical basis of predatory capitalism. Grounded in Marx and Lenin, it attacked capitalism's inherent evils, monstrous inequities, and flagrant injustices that, when exacerbated by speculation, exploitation, and fraud, would eventually destroy it. And it promoted world revolution to that end. The Cold War required further refinement of the American myth. Instead of simply intervening where circumstances supposedly demanded that we impose our system, America now had to be the shield and bulwark of the sacred capitalist system in which free enterprise, magically identified with democracy, was equally to be defended. This version held through many surrogate confrontations in the era of mutually assured destruction, and survived even the debacle of Viet Nam, lasting until the collapse of the Soviet Union. On radio and television, Americans were subjected to an unrelenting barrage of hyper-patriotism, in which American moral superiority was a given, and America's self-touted courage, generosity, and decency were its unchallengeable proofs. The implosion of the Soviet Union left America, in its own terms, the sole superpower in a unipolar world, which required further retooling of the myth. The practical effect of having no doomsday enemy, China wouldn't do yet, was to supercharge its element of pure hubristic ego. America was no longer just the defender of the free world from heresy. It was now, by virtue of its glorious self-touted exceptionalism, required to oversee and police it in the interests and for the benefit of all. Power tends to corrupt, said Lord Acton, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When the only rival to American power disintegrated, our ruling elite saw the opportunity, for the first time in history, for one country to absolutely dominate and control the world. This consensus was expressed in a policy statement by major hard right-wing political players titled The Project for a New American Century. This triumphalist manifesto laid out a plan for absolute American access to and control of essential resources and raw materials worldwide, guaranteed by our military enforcing full-spectrum dominance. The American myth, which had lost some momentum in the totally unexpected so-called Cold War victory, was now re-energized with a proactive essence and endowed with the glowing radiance of a true and, for the first time, self-professed imperial mission. The attack on the towers, an unimaginable provocation, was the trigger mechanism for the explosive launch of the effort to impose that imperial model in practice on the world. It has been without question the most spectacular failure in the history of American misadventure. After a decade marked by the waste of trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, the stunning bankruptcy of our internally burglarized nation, and a consequent recession more fundamentally damaging than the Great One, Imperial America has nothing to show for the astonishing folly of its arrogant overreach, but unequivocal disasters in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, with no end of madness in sight. It is clear that the hypnotic hold of the American myth on the loyalty of the people has led only to disgrace and tragedy, and set a course to inevitable imperial decline and ruin. This truth, though, entirely mistakes the purpose of the myth. It was never intended to serve either our country or our people. It was created solely to shield, buttress, and exalt the financial ruling class. It has done that with complete and astonishing success. As a prime example, the massive looting of funding for the Iraq-Afghanistan-Pakistan wars to enrich the corporate tyranny is on a unique scale of its own, without anything remotely comparable to its flagrant obscenity in the whole long history of war. Neither the Pentagon nor the government can account for the billions of dollars that have vanished there. There is no doubt that beyond the outrageously inflated no-bid contracts given to giant corporations with their obscene guaranteed profits, much of the money was simply stolen by, through, or in spite of the military, and distributed among thieves and accomplices. Much of it came in bricks on huge pallets, for convenience, presumably. As this wholesale corporate robbery was in progress under military oversight abroad, the corporate tyranny evolved a new set of impenetrably complex devices for the generation of money without either any economically productive source or result at home. The sole driving force and purpose of capitalism is, of course, the realization of profit. According to that iron calculus, reducing production costs increases profit margin. This leads to the obvious conclusion that as production costs near zero, profit is maximized. There is no provision for social good in capitalist theory. Corporations, created to optimize commercial opportunity through efficient specialization, were originally required to operate for public good, but that provision was quickly finessed and forgotten. American law courts have always favored corporate concentrations of wealth since they, like the Congress, exist to serve moneyed interests. And the judiciary has consistently cooperated in ruling reliably for corporations and against the interests of the people. Indeed, without considering the question in law, the Supreme Court long ago endowed corporations with personhood, that is, with all the rights of human beings under our Constitution. That this travesty occurred as a slipshod clerical error shows that the court preferred to mask this perversion of the intent of the 14th Amendment as an unexamined assumption, rather than risk an eventual test which would have created public outrage. Given the collusion of Congress and the courts in securing legal invulnerability for the corporate tyranny, and the fact that corporations' only duty is maximization of profit, it was inevitable that megabanks, huge brokerage houses, giant insurance conglomerates, gilded hedge funds, and credit agencies pretending to certify their work all engaged in massive criminal fraud and deception for just that purpose. The result was the crash of '08, the recession, and the unprecedented bailout of the biggest banks and investment houses with taxpayer dollars. So much for the invisible hand of the free market. In recent years, two related trends have battered the American myth. First, any belief the world had in it has been shattered by a catastrophic series of imbecile military disasters which has eroded its efficacy at home. Second, in response, the state has made crude efforts to boost its waning power by imposing totalitarian-style surveillance, intimidation, and coercion on the American people to a degree unprecedented in scope and scale. The vast, clanking medieval apparatus of Homeland Security that has sprouted like an enormous poison fungus since 9/11, with its brutal police state mindset, the odious Patriot Act with its flagrant subversions of the Bill of Rights, the endless fantasy-based terror peddling of the prostitute corporate media with its clowns and harpies churning irrational fear and anger in the uninformed, all this grim repressive machinery is a ham-handed attempt to distract Americans from the real causes of their injury, abuse, and oppression. And yet, even with the American myth now exposed for the tissue of lies, deceptions, and frauds that it has always been, it still keeps its phenomenal hold on the great mass of American people. The sad reality is that for the majority, their own identities have been so deeply and thoroughly infused with the myth that to disbelieve it is to disbelieve in themselves. So the dead American myth lives on in its deadness, horribly masking our crapshot economy, our bankrupt debtor's prison of a society, our ghost dance charade of kabuki democracy, while typhoons of impending social, economical, and ecological disaster build their enormous, lightning-charged thunderheads above the dark future before us. And what does the dead myth still obscure? What is beyond the wall of failing deception and dishonesty? What horrors has the shoddy fable so long and effectively concealed? It is a world brutalized by the violence of our imperialist mania. It is the wrecked and pillaged economies looted by our predatory capitalist austerity regimes. It is the hundreds of millions of starved, dying children sacrificed to Wall Street commodities gaming. It is the multitudes of innocent, ignorant people barely surviving under absolutist regimes propped up by our tax dollars, while our banks siphon off profits from arming their brutal police states and bribing their kings, sheikhs, or generals. It is the millions of dead and maimed and raped populations of simple tribal people that our indiscriminately murderous juggernaut has left in its bloody wake in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. It is the bitter and appalling legacy of hate and repulsion, disdain and fear which America has earned with its hegemonist villainy in every region of the world. And at home, what is it we Americans have been so complicit in hiding from ourselves, in our devotion to the perverse legend that has come to inhabit our souls like an incubus? It is millions of us with no work or hope in middle age whose jobs and homes have been devoured by the sick fraud machine of Wall Street. It is the trashed, demolished weed lots of our major cities crumbling in fire-gutted ruin. It is the many cities with industries defunct and factories dismantled and shipped overseas. It is our decaying, defunded public schools, our bankrupt states and counties, our overtaxed, antiquated public transportation systems, our obsolete, dissolving infrastructure, our gigantic and irrational prisons horror, our cynical healthcare con game, and over it all, the jackboot mechanism of our police state, armed and empowered, ready for use against us all. This is where we are. The great question now is whether we can awaken from our long nightmare and face the terrifying and exhilarating prospect of living in reality without the false props and dishonest constructs of a hoodwinked and dishonored people, or whether we have internalized the falsity to such an extent that it has become a collective insanity. In 1846, Henry David Thoreau, offended to his soul by the American invasion of Mexico, protested and went to jail. In his essay on civil disobedience, he said this of state policy: "If injustice is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine." To attempt to break the death grip of the American myth will be a titanic challenge. To even begin to rebel against the might of the national security state will require the courage to face far more than official disapproval. Imperial America will respond to even the most peaceful and orderly protest with hard police action, and the level of repression will rise with the scope and seriousness of the action undertaken. Small protests will have no effect. Organized mass demonstrations will draw the brutally motivated national security state apparatus down upon them. Americans, excepting our underclass, have no experience with violent police or military repression. Those who commit peaceful civil disobedience will swiftly find to their cost how it works. In a national security state that has eradicated all laws that prevent abuse of the public, whatever the state does is legal. To such a pass have we in America come, as a result of our long historic indoctrination and abject submission to our ruling class. To achieve any redemption for Americans, to make possible any more just, humane, and life-honoring society, will require complete abandonment of the system of predatory capitalism. It offers no prospect of reform or improvement, and we have all been witness to the absurdly corrupt idiocy of our so-called democratic process for generations. America is nearing the greatest crisis point in its history, and the terrific coming cataclysm will determine the future of our country. If we cannot rise in dominating numbers to reject the heartless, mindless, soulless machine of imperial predatory capitalism, we will be condemned to a fascistic command and control horror in which human beings are mere possessions of the state, units of production or service, and then perhaps not even that, as excess population in that brave new world may simply be eliminated. That end is not inevitable. We are not lost. We are not defeated, since to this moment we have not engaged. We have not honored our responsibility as human beings. We have not defended our humanity. We have abjured our power and let ourselves be ruled. All around the world, the rolling thunder of irresistible outrage is now heard and felt. In Egypt and Spain, Syria and Greece, Iraq and Sudan, Afghanistan and Ireland, everywhere the legitimate anger of humanity is fueling an uprising against the dead hand of predatory capitalism and its evils. And in Americans, so long trapped, encapsulated like flies in amber in a false religion of state idolatry, the anger is deep, widespread, and growing. The myth is broken and dead. It is up to those who know and care to lead. Thomas Paine said, "These are the times that try men's souls." Nothing is guaranteed us. That can't matter. We cannot consider odds or outcomes. We simply cannot let the machine of injustice grind on. We must confront with calm courage a vicious, tyrannical system that is destroying the earth and its life and its people. We must put our lives on the line to oppose it, and we must do it now. The nightmare machine of rapacious exploitation has overthrown decency and reason, and its bloody human treason flourishes over us. This must be ended. We must end it. Let your life be a friction to stop the machine.
Doesn't make any sense. How do you sleep at night? There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this, man. There's no honor in this shit. There is no honor in this shit.
Who was the narrator?
Yeah, I was gonna ask
that voice.
Yeah.
He's a professional announcer. I don't know his name, but if I work at it, I can find out for you.
What was it called?
This is Let Your Life Be no. The appropriate one is called Become the Friction. Let me expand this. I can send you the website where you can download it.
It's quite apparent from just the last quote, it wasn't really an election, but that Trump just was not impeached, number one, and that, what was his name, that said Trump should have been impeached, and the Republican Party kicked him out.
Romney.
Romney.
Talking about Senator Romney. He's the only Republican senator that voted against the first article of impeachment.
And so the Republican Party kicked him out of the party.
Took Romney out. Well, they were doing.
No, I don't think they kicked him out.
That's what the report on the media has been saying. That he's no longer a Republican, as far as they're concerned. He's not following party lines, so he's no longer a Republican. Which, just what they were talking about. Of course, there again, how can you trust the media? I'm a little bit of a skeptic myself.
I'm a whole lot of a skeptic. The media, in my opinion, is there to, the media is part of the Barker system on the midway of the carnival. And the whole goal of the Barker is to keep you from looking behind the curtain to see what's going on inside the tent.
I think this film was really good. I mean, I don't disagree with anything it said. I would only know what's left out, which happens a lot.
Well, we're going to start talking about some of the stuff that's left out next week.
Well, I can just say it quickly. It leaves out sexual violence. Sexual violence against women and against children, which increases, accelerates with that kind of military violence. And so you can't really.
It seems like it focuses too much on corporations and capitalism versus, you know, the powers go beyond that. And I mean the ruling families and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, that would be my question for next week. Who, you know, when they keep talking about corporations, well, are they talking about private corporations? Are they talking about publicly held corporations? I thought we were talking about the people above the corporations. And they kind of here vilify corporations.
They
as a
stopped
group.
at a certain point. And I
But that's true with most
we go try to go
I thought we were
beyond
talking about
that.
people who have, you know, own everything and they're not really necessarily involved with corporations.
The the corporation structure is incredibly advantageous to the people who own the corporations, because it is possible, you cannot imprison a corporation, and the corporation does not die. Whereas you can imprison a human being, and you can execute a human being. So a corporation has certain advantages in the law that a human being does not, which is why, for example, people join LLCs, limited liability corporations, because your liability can be limited by the structure of the corporation. And the bigger the corporation, the more money that corporation has to defend itself against any lawsuit. So that, for example, it took a class action suit against the tobacco companies because no individual victim of lung cancer was in a financial position. They can keep a particular lawsuit going for 25 years while the person who brings the lawsuit is getting older and older and older. So that this is also the advantage of certain power groups. The certain power groups do not think in terms of a human lifespan, they think in terms of centuries. If they can accumulate 10% of the media power per lifespan inside of 200 years, they have the media.
I'm just saying, like, when we talk about the ruling families, like the DuPonts, all these families, I mean, that's kind of what we've talked about is the ruling elite. We haven't necessarily talked in this class about the ruling elite being corporations.
No,
There's a huge
the ruling
variance.
elites have heartbeats. Let's be clear on that.
Yeah.
The corporations are useful legal structures
For
used
some-
by
they
the ruling
stand
elite.
behind it.
Exactly.
For some of them.
Well, we can get into that on another.
Well, but he was talking about predator capitalism.
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
not saying capitalism in general, we're saying predator capitalism.
I'm going to point out how, as a distinction between capitalism and predator capitalism, that a young man who was a member of the Johnson & Johnson family made his own documentary by filming his own family. And as part of that documentary, it came out that when a particular member of the Johnson & Johnson family begins to have twinges of conscience about being so wealthy and perhaps about the methods by which they acquired that wealth, the family has a solution for that. They have an in-house psychologist who helps that person deal with his guilt feelings.
Rehabilitation.
So he no longer feels guilty about exploitation.
What I liked about the film is that it talks about capitalism and striving for profit, and it implies anyway that living in this kind of structure, this capitalist structure where profit is everything and controlling people in other countries is everything, it undermines our values.
Oh,
And
it didn't deal
we have to
directly
change our
with...
value system to change that because we're too, affected by that.
But what I think is interesting is that corporations, corporations or whoever is ruling that is through media and everything, they actually they prey on people's emotions, just like the family have psychologists. They have probably mind control groups where it's like, how do you impose that on people is through emotions. So when you think of media, half of the daytime shows is like, as long as one of their presidential candidate is dancing out on the stage and people like that person, people are going to go along with whatever. One of the things I think is, we were talking about vaccines, is ridiculing people that don't get vaccines. It's like, oh, those kooks, so it's using people's emotions to sway, these capitalist agendas.
So, but then the capitalism itself affects our emotions.
Yeah.
And the ones that we use to control people.
It's not so, if we could see it like that, it would be more,
I may have a cartoon up here on Lauren. There is a marvelous cartoon that is part of Caitlin Johnston's essay on, here it is. And I bet the cartoon will come up. No, I copied it without the cartoon. The cartoon has a gnome-like figure sitting on a rock. And the gnome is saying, first you have to unlearn everything you were taught.
I've seen that one.
And it's right. It's an unlearning process because, again, Johnstone writes another article that we are dumped into this earth, onto this planet, as wet blobs of protoplasm on a battlefield. And the battlefield, the guns that are shooting on the battlefield are guns of stories and narratives and facts and information. And your parents give you one set of information, your pastor or priest or whoever gives you another set of information, your television advertisers give you another set of information, your teachers, especially under the control of our government, gives you another set of information, and hopefully people between, say, 12 and 21, someone has taught them to begin unlearning all of that and start finding out what's really going on for themselves. But I can speak as someone who didn't start really learning until I was 55, that's a hard process.
People have mental breakdowns because of that.
Pardon?
I think people become having mental breakdowns because of things like that. I think
That's
that's one of the ways that I think an interesting aspect you mentioned, the ways that people are being controlled through vaccinations different ways. But one is also the chemical incarceration of people, obviously through all of, ADD, the depression, all of these things in this, kind of psychotic world, people having these symptoms and them being medicated for them instead of it maybe being a normal occurrence.
It helps to have one of the power centers be distributing pharmaceuticals that will help keep the population docile.
Exactly.
I would love to see the data. There are people who say that fluoride has a calming effect on the human psyche. I would love to see the data on that because fluoride is the only drug that is delivered to a mass population independent of the size of the patient and the amount of drug consumed. Larry?
And I, for one, my dentist recommended that I use a very high fluoride toothpaste to stop my teeth from aching. It will actually, brushing with a high fluoride toothpaste will stop your teeth from hurting. You don't have to have your fillings, have fillings put into your teeth. Just brush with fluoride.
And except for other consequences.
And it does. It deadens it so that you don't even feel the pain.
Dan, thanks for being here.
Thank you. See you next week.
It maybe it deadens your brain at the same time as it deadens your nerve ending.
Very, very
well. In terms of biochemistry, I will tell you there's absolutely no doubt that fluoride is detrimental to fetuses and infants.